English found what they could not accomplish with the torch and the gun, they could accomplish with the stroke of a pen. So that's why they mislabeled our people racially in the records more and more as time went on, until eventually there was no Indian presence in the records. There was never that designation. You were identified as mulatto, musty, or any of those other terms rather than Indian.
Such was the effort to erase Indians from history that up until the early 20th century, scientists of academic institutions deliberately altered census records.
In Virginia, there was a leader of the eugenics movement, a man by the name of Dr. Walter Plecker. He changed records of Virginia Indians that were born and recorded as Indian people to say that they were colored. He did this on birth certificates, marriage certificates, on death certificates, on any legal records that he could get his hands on. So since he physically destroyed or changed records of so many Virginia Indians, he essentially committed an act of bureaucratic genocide on the Virginia Indians. I can't see a more obvious event than what happened in the 20th century in terms of Virginia Indians being written out of history.
Sometimes it got to the point where you were even afraid to say that you were Indian. And you told your children not to because it was safer. And so there were just all these different ways of erasing Native people as well as African American people from the cultural landscapes.
At one point in time, it was a bad thing to even say you were Native American. Some people had to lie on their birth certificates and state that they were either black or that they were white. So that definitely had an effect on Native American people.
Native people have become the invisible minority here, particularly in the Northeast. The census takers, who were generally white males, made their decision about who was Indian and who was not Indian. And if you did not look Indian, then you didn't get on the census as being Indian. And so those records, whether it was talking about slavery, whether it was talking about indentured servants, you know, it's like putting a 50 million piece puzzle together.
Shalom. Much love and respect to all the tribes out there. Pura vida. The American Indian is the so-called negro. Yeah, we in part 20. I hope this is clear to you by now. We've learned so much, right? And we got so much more to learn. You know, so we've been going in on topics such as indentured servants, slavery, you know, statute laws, and all that was going on in these early colonies, these first colonies, and also the infamous date of 1619, right? Alright, so we're going to continue to discuss these subjects and finish some of the books and articles we've been digging on in the last two videos. So if you have not watched part 18 and 19, I highly recommend that you actually go back and watch them so you can, you know, understand better this, you know, this part 20. Alright, so you know, right away I want to get into something that very few people know and talk about, but it's something that totally shows how made up the historical narratives that are always given to us. You know, they're so false and made up. So they tell us, you know, that the first so-called Negro slaves, or Negroes in general, came into the United States in 1619. Remember, this is the official story they give us and teach us in schools. Well, we already know this is completely false, because you've been here. You've been here since creation. Oh, who had corn? Who created agriculture? Come on. But there's a whole history, right? Before 1619. And the English were not the first to settle parts of the United States. And not the first to record that Negro, so-called Negro slaves, were brought up to the United States. All right, somebody else had done that before the English. So let's take a trip 100 years before 1619, real quick. All right, real quick, we're in this book. It's called An Inquiry into the Law of Negro Slavery in the United States of America, to which is prefixed An Historical Sketch of Slavery by Thomas R. Cobb of Georgia. All right. And again, we've been talking about the first so-called slaves that arrived in North America, in Virginia, 1619, right? So this also mentions it in this book. There's a lot of hijack in this book. It just keeps saying African and African, and it doesn't show the sources when it says African, but sometimes it does have sources. But for example, it's not agreeing on the date. So it says here 13 years. It says in 1607, the first successful English colony was landed at Jamestown in Virginia, all right? So 13 years thereafter, in 1620, so not 1619, it says 1620 here, right? Remember they said that these dates don't agree, or you're going to hear that a lot. Some historians don't agree on the date or the year. A Dutch man of war landed 20 Negro slaves for sale, all right? Negro, not Africans, all right? So it says Negro, people of color, right? This was the germ of Negro slaveholding in the territory now occupied by the United States of America. The Spaniards may have introduced them at an earlier day in Florida. Wait, whoa. So wait, in history, they've been always telling us that the first so-called African slaves or first so-called Negroes, colored people, right? Because they tell us that, you know, you weren't here, that you came from Africa, and that the first time that any of your ancestors ever arrived here was in 1619 in Virginia. But we know that's false, right? We know that the American Indian is the so-called Negro, all right? But we have records. There is recorded history of the Spaniards writing down that they had brought Negroes. It doesn't say Africans to them either when in their accounts. It says they had also come up with some Negroes way before 1619. This was in 1520s, in the 1520s. Yes, the Spanish had colonies and settlements in America way before the English. They weren't successful like the English, but they tried, and they had set a lot of settlements. So again, it says the Spaniards may have introduced them at an earlier day in Florida, but this we have no certain knowledge. All right. For many years, the number of Negroes in Virginia was comparatively small. All right, this was small. The number of Negroes. What do they mean? Other American Indians that are being brought up from the West Indies? Is that what they're talking about? The introduction of cultivation of tobacco increased the demand and finally impressed upon Virginia and Maryland the position of slaveholding states. So they're saying the introduction and the cultivation of tobacco. Now, who was really working in these tobacco fields? All right, we know already. Look at the images. All right, so why would so-called Africans still have their whole gear on and everything and their feathers? We know who this is. This is American Indians that showing these depictions. All right. All right. So remember, why are we even talking about 1619 and first so-called African slaves when we know in its recorded history that the Spanish, right? The Spanish had settlements in the United States way before the English in 1607, 1619, whenever they brought their so-called slaves. And they have recorded that they also brought up so-called Negroes. All right, so who was first? All right, so we can throw that out the window. What you're talking about 400 years. You see, this is all make-believe. All right. So the book is called The Spanish Settlements Within the Present Limits of the United States from 1513 to 1561 by Woodbury Lowery. It says with maps, and this is from 1911. All right, so real quick, in the preface of this book, it says, in 1607, a little band of English gentlemen, laborers, and artisans, alien in religion and race to the two great Catholic and Latin powers, which then had practically divided between them the northern half of the New World, made their first enduring settlement in Virginia. And but 13 years later, in 1620, the Cape Cod colony was founded. Plymouth? Are we talking about the Plymouth? At first, these Anglo-Saxons spread along the narrow strip of territory between the Alleghenies and the Atlantic. Then, like an iron wedge, the English colonists penetrated the domain of their rivals, thrust them apart on either side, and with ever-increasing dimensions pressed farther and farther across the continent until they have occupied almost the entire territory which had previously belonged to France and Spain. All these territories in the United States were of France and Spain before the English got there. There's a whole history there before the English colonies. That's what I'm trying to explain to you. All right. So we're in chapter 2 of this book, and it begins with continuing in the last chapter. It was talking about Ponce de Leon. If you guys don't know, one of the first Spanish colonizers. He actually, made it to Florida. One of the first so-called Spaniards to make it to Florida and discover it, supposedly, right? And some of the islands there, like Bimini and other islands near Florida. So it says here, sterile, as was the result of his expedition in the acquisition of gold and slaves. So he was trying to get gold and slaves because he had heard of the Fountain of Youth and gold and all these legends of Florida. All right, remember Ponce de Leon. All right, and so he wasn't able to because they kept fighting him. The ancestors kept fighting him, even though they were getting slaughtered by their canyons and guns. They were still fighting them. They weren't able to, penetrate the land. So it says Ponce, nonetheless, determined to secure possession of his new discovery. Proceeding at once to Spain, he obtained through the influence of his old friend Pedro Núñez de Guzmán a second patent, dated September 27, 1514, much more explicit than the first, confirming his title. The patent empowered Ponce to settle the island of Bimini and the island of Florida, an island, that's what they thought it was, I guess, which he had discovered, but that he was first required to reduce the Caribes. He needs to reduce the Caribes before proceeding to make his settlement. The grant ran for 3 years from the date of embarkation, and he was further allowed to employ in the attempt at colonization the vessels and men he led against the Caribes. All right. As soon as there should be no further need of his presence, the patent authorized him to build dwelling houses, towns in the island, such as are built in these kingdoms, and even specified in part the details of their construction. It also renewed the command that no one should seek for slaves within his islands without his consent. So don't come looking for slaves here. Where? In Florida and Bimini? All right, so who was there to enslave? Indians, right? So what were the Spanish doing? Enslaving Indians, not Africans. Why did he have to make a law? Why did he have to tell them, yo, don't come over here to enslave? All right, I'm going to enslave these people. I'm going to make them work. All right, because that's what they were doing at that time. Spanish were enslaving Indians, not Africans. And by the thousands at that time, thousands and thousands. All right, so now look at what Ponce is going to say. All right, and I've been telling you that the Spanish had a type of similar system as indentured servitude. They called encomienda. They had repartimiento, asientos. I mean, they had so many things, but it was just another form of servitude. All right, they had servants. The Indians had servants, an encomienda system, right? They called it. Now he says here, Ponce says, should require of the caciques and Indians in said islands, in the best manner that they could be made to understand that was said to them, in conformity with a requisition which had been drawn up by many learned men, that they should come to the knowledge of our Catholic faith, to obey and serve as they are bounden. And you shall have written down by 2 or 3 scriveners, if they obey, and before as many witnesses and trustworthy persons as shall be there, that it may serve as our justification. And if after the above procedure they seek not to obey the contents of said requisition, in such case you may make war upon them and enslave them. But if they obey, you shall treat them as best you can, and shall seek in every possible way that they be converted to our holy Catholic faith. And if after having once rendered obedience to said requisition, again in Spanish is called requerimiento. Now they're talking about, and I've mentioned this in the other videos, that when the Spanish got there, Columbus and all of them, they had this kind of they had this document, this legal document they read out. It was called their requerimiento, that they read out to the Indians in their language. So the Indians obviously didn't understand, right? So they would say, you have to accept, the Catholic Church, you have to accept Jesus and the kingdom and serve the queen and king, and you have to do it, or else we will enslave you and take all your land and your things and everything. And the Indians didn't know. So it was like a game they were playing with them, right? So they can say, oh, well, we told them at least, and they chose war, or that, like it's saying here, right? So if they disobey, what happens is we should enslave them, right? That's what it says here, right? So this is the requisition or requerimiento. It's called in Spanish. Look it up. They shall rebel. I command that you shall again cause them to comply with the said requisition before making war upon them or doing them any harm or damage. I mean, so eventually Ponce was able to conquer the Caribs and, settle in this island, other islands around there in Florida. The whole area they were calling Florida. Even the islands, Bimini and Guadalupe and all that, they were all that calling all Florida. It seems in a lot of these records. All right, so a lot of the Spaniards were doing the same. So there's other accounts. It says here in February of the following year, 1517, Francisco Hernandez de Cordova sailed from Havana with 3 ships and 110 men. Among them were some noblemen who had come to Cuba but a few months before, and a priest to say mass for them and administer the sacraments. Diego Velázquez, at that time governor of Cuba, had sold the adventurers one of the ships on the condition that it should be paid for in slaves, which were to be secured by making war upon the Indians in the Lucayan Islands, all right, not Africans. These kind of, once again, the Spaniards were enslaving or putting Indians into servitude, not Africans. All right, so I just wanted to show you some examples what they were doing. There's a lot of accounts of different Spaniards going on different voyages or expeditions of discovery, right? They were really basically looking for slaves and gold and how to exploit whatever, whoever they found in whatever land or country they landed in America. All right, so now there is one dude that is very important to what I was saying earlier, how they teach us that the first so-called Negroes came in 1619. That was by the English, but that is so wrong. All right, this is a person you probably never heard of in your life. It's a Spaniard, one of those Spaniards. All right, his name was Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón. So Ayllón. All right, so it says here, there was living in Hispaniola a certain Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón of Toledo, who had come there with Ovando, from whom he received the appointment of alcalde mayor or mayor, right? Mayor of La Concepcion and other towns. He had now become one of the auditors of the island, and he was said to be a man of considerable intelligence, well educated and virtuous, according to the standard of the times, though unlearned in the arts of war, never having done a corselet or borne a sword to earn his wages therewith, says Oviedo, who was personally acquainted with him. He was very rich, having received from Ovando 400 Indians in repartimientos in payment of his salary, as was that time the custom. All right, so what are they talking about? Repartimiento. So the Spaniards, when they took over, settlements, Indian settlements, and they put them and grouped them wherever they had their missions or whatever, then they will distribute them. So repartir in Spanish is to distribute. So repartimiento is like a distribution of the Indians. So he got 400. That's a lot. Because I have, like in my country, this happened in 1569 in Costa Rica, where they put all the Indians in missions because we were living all spread out through the whole country. So they gathered us up and put us in different missions. Once they had us in the missions, they did their repartimientos. And I have a book with the list, the numbers they distributed to each Spaniard or colonist, right? And again, they call it repartimiento, and then it becomes an encomienda. So now you had an indentured servant, right? So this guy had, he got lucky. He got 400 Indians, right? That's a lot of servants, right? Stirred up, no doubts, by reports of kingdoms to be had for the mere asking, Ayllón associated himself with Diego Caballero, clerk of the Audiencia of the island, secured a license for his undertaking, and in 1520 dispatched a caravel from the port of La Plata, having Francisco Gordillo as captain and Alonso Fernandez Sotil as pilot, with directions to sail northward until the continent was reached. All right, so remember, this is in, if you don't know, in Santo Domingo, which is in Hispaniola, Dominican Republic. All right, this is where they're talking about. All right, so it so happened that shortly before the departure of Ayllón's caravel, Juan Ortiz de Matienzo, another auditor of the same island, had sent out a caravel under the command of Pedro de Quechos in search of Caribs. All right, in search of what? Caribs to sell as slaves. Caribs to sell as slaves. All right, not Africans. You see, they're putting all their time and effort, all their charters, everything they're being financed from their Spanish king and queen, right? So look what they're enslaving. All right, look where they're doing it. They're doing it here. What again? They're in search of Caribs to sell as slaves in virtue of the general license of October 30, 1503. That's what I was just talking about. All right, so a license to basically enslave Carib Indians, right? Not Africans, Carib Indians. In this traffic, the auditor's name did not openly appear, having failed to secure the intended cargo. Quejo's caravel was returning home when in the neighborhood of the island of Lucayonique, it fell with Ayllón's vessel, which apparently had been cruising about for several months on errands of which no account remains. So these errands, I wonder what they were. Were they enslaving American Indians? Is that what these errands were? That is not, there's no accounts of. Here the two commanders exchanged advices, and Quejos finally decided to sail with Gordillo for the mainland, intending, as it subsequently appeared, to fill his empty hold with slaves to go get Caribs, all right? So he joined up and to go to the mainland. They're talking about North America, the United States, like Florida and Louisiana, all these places, the mainland. To get what? To fill his empty hold with slaves, to get slaves. They ain't trying to colonize, they're going up there to get slaves. Sailing slowly northward for 8 or 9 days, or as some report, driven by stress of weather. In June of the year following Gordillo's departure in 1521, the two caravels came upon the continent in latitude 33 degrees 30, according to Quejo's testimony, at the mouth of a considerable river to which the name of St. John the Baptist was given, because of its discovery on the feast day of the saint. The Indians appear to have called the country Chicora, and it lay perhaps somewhere in the vicinity of Cape Fear. 20 men were sent ashore in the boats to secure the goodwill of the natives, the necessity of which Ayllón had impressed upon his commander, while the ship sought to enter the river. We're at this website called the historynewsnetwork.org. It says from Columbia College in Arts of Sciences, the George Washington University, the forgotten first attempt to plant a colony on U.S. soil. And this is going to correlate with what we just actually read in the book. We're going to go back to it, but I just wanted to show you that it says in June 1526, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, a wealthy Spanish official in the city of Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, founded a colony near the mouth of the Petey River in eastern South Carolina. This is what we're talking about. He just sent Gordillo, he just came back from. 6 decades before Roanoke Island, 1587, 8 decades before Jamestown, 1607, and almost a century before the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620th century, 100 years before, Ayllón began his North American dream. Ayllón's effort has been overlooked, perhaps because most people prefer to believe that the U.S. life began with the arrival of English-speaking Anglo-Saxons living under the British law. Perhaps its settlements neglected because of its tragic fate, death by mismanagement, disease, and slave revolt. Perhaps it is unmentioned because of its unique rebirth in the woods by people not considered a worthy part of the U.S. heritage. Ayllón prepared for his great adventure in 1520 by sending Captain Francisco Gordillo, that's what we just read about in the other book, to locate a good landing site and build friendly relations with the local inhabitants. The captain instead teamed up with a slave hunter, Pedro de Quejos. You hear this? That's the other guy in the book, right? And Quejos, remember, had a license to enslave Carib Indians. It was a license he was given. It's not that he was just a slave hunter. He was given a license by the king. While failing to survey a site or build good relations with anyone, the two men captured 17 Native Americans. Captured who? 17 Native Americans, not Africans, and brought them back to Santo Domingo as slaves. The first European act on what is now U.S. soil was making slaves of free men and women. Again, the first European act on what is now U.S. soil, the first act ever by any European and American in the United States, all right, was making slaves of free men and women. Free, not, so you're not those, you're not a descendant of slaves, you were free men and women. They made slaves out of you or servants out of you. The two adventurers returned to Ayllón with enchanting tales of naming a great river in the honor of St. John the Baptist. You see, that's the river we just heard about, and cutting Christian crosses and trees. Ayllón was not impressed with their seizure of 17 Native Americans and brought the issue to the attention of a commission presided over by Diego Columbus. The Indians were declared free and ordered returned, but Spanish records do not show whether the order was carried out, so we don't know if they were returned. We're going to get into the other book again. We're going to go back to the historic accounts, but they do not show that Ayllón to make amends with the natives who lost their loved ones, sent back the slaver Quejos who started the problem. Once again, Quejos returned with other captured natives. He this time claimed volunteered to serve as guides for the Spain's expedition. So he sent them back, I guess, to get captured or something. I don't know why he sent them back. I guess he came back with more slaves, talking about they volunteered. Ayllón also retained one of the original 70, which he named Ferdinand Chicorana. He kept one of them as his New World interpreter. Impressed with his skills and knowledge of the mainland, he brought Chicorana to Spain to meet the king. After this meeting, King Ferdinand issued an order permitting Ayllón to sail for the coast of North America. The king's orders forbade enslavement of Indians and added, "You be very careful about the treatment of the Indians." 3 Dominican missionaries were sent to protect Native Americans from Europeans. With this record as backdrop, Ayllón prepared to launch his expedition to North America. After some delays, his fleet of 6 vessels sailed from Puerto de la Plata. Aboard were 500 Spanish men and women, 100 enslaved Africans. Wait a minute. What are we talking about? 1526, right? Wait. But you told us, right? This is from the George Washington University, Columbia Colleges of Arts and Sciences, right? What are they telling us here? I mean, we're going to read it in the other book, but we're going to see who they really were, if they were really Africans, right? But what are they telling us? That they brought 100 enslaved Africans. So I thought it was in 1619 that the first so-called enslaved Africans arrived in North America or United States. You see what I'm trying to show you, right? How it's all a lie. It's just like a movie. It's like a script they're giving you, right? They declared that the first so-called. They wanted that as a reference point, a starting point for some reason. But you can see that this expedition of Ayllón in 1526 to South Carolina brought with him 100 enslaved negroes, which they're calling Africans here. I mean, these characters, these Spaniards we're talking about in the book we're reading right now, I don't see no accounts of them enslaving Africans anywhere, going or buying any Africans in their records. All over their records, all these Spaniards are enslaving American Indians. All right. So first of all, there's a lot of lies in there, a lot of things to unveil, a lot of layers, right? You see what I'm showing you, right? So first of all, it's not Africans, and second, this is way before 1619, almost 100 years before, 100 years. All right, real quick, we're in this other book. It's called Lucas Vasquez, the Ayllón's Doomed Colony of San Miguel de Gualdape. This is from the Georgia Historical Quarterly, I guess volume 85. All right, so it says here, following Ponce de Leon's abortive 1521 attempt to establish a colony on the west coast of the peninsula of La Florida, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón led a Spanish expedition that intended to found a colony in La Florida, but far north of Ponce de Leon's site. Ayllón was spurred on in this endeavor by the report of Captain Pedro de Salazar, a slave trader who happened upon a new and undiscovered land northwest of the Bahamas sometime between 1514 and 1516. Salazar spoke favorably on the desirability of the land itself and also brought back Indians. Brought back who? Indians, a slave, right? A slave trader. What was he trading? Or who was he enslaving? Indians of giant stature who commanded a high price in Española, which he was selling in Santo Domingo or Hispaniola in the West Indies. All right, he was grabbing Indians from North America, bringing them to Hispaniola. He was a slave trader again. All right, so who were they slaving? They enslaving Africans. Based on Salazar's report, Ayllón sent an able navigator, Francisco Gordillo, in search of his utopian land, peopled by giant Indians. Gordillo was joined by a fellow pilot in another vessel, and the two ships departed Great Abaco Island on a northerly course in search of Salazar's reported discovery. They sailed north for an estimated 110 to 115 leagues. All right. When their soundings indicated they were near land, consequently they turned west to seek the shore. On June 24, 1521, a day after the feast of St. John the Baptist, the two navigators found land and anchored in the river, which they appropriately named the Jordan River. The Jordan River? Because of the association with John the Baptist? The distance north of the Bahamas, together with the description of the river by Pedro Martir, and his decades, would place the Jordan River as the wide and deep Waccamaw River. The Waccamaw. If you guys know this area, this is where they're talking about. Emptied into Winyah Bay, just south of Myrtle Beach in South Carolina. However, historian Polly Hoffman identified the Jordan River with the small Santee River south of Winyah Bay. The shallow Santee River seems an unlikely choice, as it flows through a large uninhabited tidal swamp area that could not have accommodated the large Spanish vessels nor supported the Indian villages reported at the site. Martir's description of the Jordan River fits the Waccamaw better and reads, "It extends a great distance in the same direction as the land where the Spanish anchored. The first Indian districts were called Chicorana, Chacori. Is this the original Cherokee or Chacori? Do you guys know about the Chacori tribe? Big up a new breed for letting me know about the Chacori tribe and their history. And Duhare, the Spanish name Chicora, subsequently applied to the general area, apparently came from the Indian tribe named Chacori. So are these the people they were enslaving, these tall Indians they were bringing back to Hispaniola? Gordillo and Quejo stayed in the area for nearly a month, trading with the friendly natives, who Martir asserted were indeed taller than the Indians of the islands, and explored a short distance north, south, and inland from their anchorage. All right. The site of Chicora later, 1526, became the location of Ayllón's first attempt to settle and found a colony on the eastern seaboard. During this time, Gordillo performed the required ritual ceremony as instructed and claimed the land in the name of his sponsor, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón. This act infuriated Quejo, who promptly performed the same ceremony and took possession of the land for his sponsor, Ortiz de Urrutia. At a later time, the legality of who had valid territorial rights to the region was the subject of extended litigation in the courts between Ayllón and Urrutia. Ayllón won out in the end more by default than by action of the court. In the latter part of July, Gordillo and Quejo returned to Santo Domingo with 60 tall Indians, slaves. All right, so they returned. So this is the same account. I guess it said 60 here, they said 70 over there, and glowing reports of the area around the Jordan River. All right, so these were the Chacori, maybe they were enslaving, the Chacori that you don't know about. This was the start of the Chicora legend, later embellished by Ayllón in the prolific writings of Martir. They described Chicora as utopian land that did not require military conquest and could easily become a new Andalusia when colonized. You hear that? In the fall of 1521, Ayllón set about laying the groundwork to obtain permission and contract with the crown for establishing the colony. Martir's detailed account indicates that through political maneuvering, Ayllón had obtained a license for the discovery and settlement of Chicora in mid-summer 1523. Alright, so continuing in the book, here it says, Quejo's voyage set the stage for Ayllón to launch his plan to put a settlement on La Florida at Chicora. Ayllón's colonizing expedition consisted of 6 ships and around 600 persons, including women and children, and a number of black slaves. Oh, all right. So you see how the website over there had African slaves? Now we got black slaves, so-called black slaves. These are just American Indians they're talking about. There were a few priests in the company, but no soldiers. This was to be a peaceful encounter with the friendly Indians, who were supposedly ready for conversion to Christianity, or at least to live and la policia as good neighbors under their own rulers. All right, so very important, right? All right, so dodge the hijack every time you're gonna hear the first so-called African slaves came in 1619. All right, because that's a lie. I just showed you 2 different sources, right? They're telling you that one said African slaves and this one says black slaves. So either way, they were so-called Negroes coming up with these people. All right, from other parts of America. So other Negroes, because there was already Negroes in America, who they bringing down to Hispaniola as slaves to work the plantations. All right, more Indians. All right, in this book we talk about Ayllón's voyage or expedition, right, to South Carolina, and it says that in the middle of July 1526. Remember, this is after 1524, and what did we get in 1524? We got Verrazano's account on how he described the Indians he met in La Florida, right? Which he said They're basically just like Ethiopians, or as dark as Ethiopians, their skin, their complexion. All right, so 1526, all right, we're talking about the same people in the same area. All right, so he sailed from the port of La Plata on the northern side of the island of Hispaniola with a fleet of 6 vessels and a large boat for tender. His company consisted of 500 men and women, most of them gathered from the islands, whose white population was sensibly depleted by their departure. So he grabbed 500 men and women, I guess, Spaniard or white Spaniard Europeans, and because of that, the whole, I guess, it depleted their population in those islands where they were. And he took with them 89 horses in addition to the necessary outfit for the colony. The pilot Quejos again accompanied him. Remember the slave trader Quejos. Among the colonists were a number of Negro slaves. Oh, okay, so we go from African slaves to black slaves. Now we got in this count, or an original, a primary source actually, Negro slaves. All right, doesn't say anything about African, Negro slaves. All right, and so what is this proving to us again? That so-called Negro or African slaves, or just any people of dark skin, what you consider a Negro, were brought way before 1619. This is in 1526, almost 100 years before. All right, 1526, we have accounts of Negro slaves being brought. How come they don't teach us this? Why are they always telling us 1619? All right, that's a lie. Didn't you see it's all a made-up lie? The whole story, 20 odd Negroes. What do you mean odd? It is well to remember that if to Catholic Spain is due the first introduction of Negro slaves, all right, so the Spanish were the first to introduce so-called Negro slaves, not English, in 1619 into the territory of the United States. All right, and one more document here about this colony, and it says here a Spanish settlement in Carolina, 1526, by J.G. Johnson, M.A., University of Georgia. All right, so continuing, says it was not until June 1526 that Ayllón was ready to set out with his colonists. Considering numbers and equipment, it was a more formidable array than that which had already conquered Mexico, or that other which was shortly to overthrow the Inca in Peru. 7 vessels, 600 men and women, among whom were several slaves, and 83 horses made up the expedition. All right, so very important. All right, so we started out in the website remember, with they said African slaves, and then we went to the other book, it said black slaves. All right, and then we went to the other book, the settlements of the Spanish settlements in America, and it told us it was Negro slaves. All right, and now in this article, right, from the Georgia Historical Quarterly, it's just saying slaves, several slaves. All right, it doesn't say Negro, black, Africans, just says slaves. It could be anybody. It could be indentured white servants, right? It could be any slave. But we know, right? We know that the Spanish were enslaving or making servants out of the Indians. Remember, this guy alone, Ayllón, was given 400. Remember, we read that already. He was given 400 in the repartimiento, in the distribution, 400 servants or slaves for his own, for him to have alone. They all got a number of servants or slaves to keep with them. Or again, Ayllón had 400 alone. All right, so several slaves came with him. All right, now remember, they called them Negro in other books. So we're just talking about the copper-colored races, all right, of America, aboriginals. We're talking about aboriginal, so-called Negroes, American Indians. That's who they were bringing up. All right, I know, I went to a lot of books and it was a lot of time and information, but I wanted just you to have this in your perspective, that, 1619 was not the beginning of, or the first time so-called Negroes arrived. Negroes were already here since creation, right? American Indians, I dodged the hijack with the whole tags they put on you, right? But I wanted to show you how big the lie is. There's so many layers to the lie, right? I mean, there's accounts. We got historic accounts of Ayllón, right? Coming from Haiti, right? Right here. Haiti right over here, the Caribbean, and going all the way up here to South Carolina, where it says Tierra de Ayllón. Look at this map, Tierra de Ayllón. All right. So, I mean, there's a whole history we don't know. I just wanted to cover that. All right, so we can continue.
Almost like the pieces of a broken puzzle, the history of Native American slavery has, for many years, lie dormant in scattered church records, wills, trade transactions, and footnotes of colonial legislations. This business was initiated by the Spanish just a year after Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492. Although it was lost to official versions of history, it was never forgotten by the descendants of the thousands of indigenous men, women, and children that were forcibly made to work for unknown masters in Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. This pre-African slavery experienced by the Indigenous Americans at the hands of the French, the English, and the Spanish followed the vagaries of political and economic interests at the core of very different colonial strategies.
If you want to understand the beginnings of Native American slavery, you have to understand the juxtaposition of the three European colonizing strategies in North America. And they were the fur trade in the Northeast, the plantation system in the South, and the Spanish mission system in Florida. One of the most poignant examples of the disruption of Indian slavery on native groups can be seen through the Appalachian Indians. When the English colony of Carolina developed in 1670, very shortly afterwards, the Appalachia became a primary target for Indian slave raids from Carolina. By 1704, the mission was devastated by these slave raids, and many Appalachi were killed. A vast majority of the remaining Appalachi were sold into slavery in Cuba. Were sold into slavery in Cuba. Were sold into slavery in Cuba.
No sign remained of the Appalachies' flourishing culture after the incursions of the English and Indian slave traders. Their temples were burned down, their magnificent council houses were destroyed, and their fields were abandoned. What was once a powerful nation of more than 6,000 people was reduced to a handful of scattered survivors.
All right, we're still in the book by the Johns Hopkins University called A History of Slavery in Virginia. Servitude, occupying a primary position in colonial development, was as regards its principles largely the product of customary law. It was a condition unknown to the common law of England and had to depend in the first instance for its sanction and definition on the growing body of colonial common law, supplemented by colonial statutes, where unity and exactness were demanded by the growing complexity of the incidents as institutional development proceeded. Owing to the simplicity of the relations of master and servant and the ability of colonial courts to regulate the rules applying to it, few statutes were called for before the middle of the 17th century. But from that point forward, the urgent necessity for legal uniformity, now threatened by the varying practices of the judiciary, could only be met by legislative action. It was in this period of growing statutory regulation that occasion arose for strictly defining the status of slavery. Slavery consequently in Virginia, Massachusetts, and a new number of the colonies rested for its earliest general sanction upon statute and was in its future development very largely the product of statutory law. As an institution, it was, like servitude, purely a colonial development, not determined nor affected by the law of England. Although slavery, unlike servitude, was recognized by the mother country and in general found in sanction in international as well as in municipal law, in this, however, Virginia and the other colonies differed from New York, where the doctrines of the civil law as enforced in Holland and not colonial law were first applied to sanction slavery. The language of legislative recognition in the several colonies indicates the essential element in the change of status. The first general sanction of slavery in Virginia was by an act of assembly on March 1661, very important date, stating that Negroes are incapable of making satisfaction for the time lost in running away by addition of time. They're not adding Indian, but they did in other books we read, right? Addition to the time of service was the customary punishment inflicted upon servants for this offense. So the Maryland law, 1663, declared that all Negroes or other slaves, there we go, other slaves, Indians, right, shall serve durante vita. The Massachusetts Fundamentals of 1641 proscribed bond, slavery, villanage, and captivity, except of captives taken in war, and of such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold. And those shall have all the liberties and Christian usages which the laws of God established in the Israel concerning such persons doth morally require, said the law. Virginia then, so far from being the first American colony to sanction domestic slavery, as has been generally believed, was in reality but the third, being preceded both by Massachusetts and Connecticut. All right, it was first legally there. Statutory recognition of slavery by the American colonies occurred as follows. All right, pay attention. Massachusetts in 1641, Connecticut in 1650, Virginia in 1661, Maryland 1663, New York and New Jersey 1664, South Carolina 1682, Pennsylvania and Rhode Island in 1700, North Carolina 1715, and Georgia 1755. Prior to these dates, the legal status of all subject Negroes was that of servants, and their rights, duties, and disabilities were regulated by legislation the same as or similar to that applied to the white servants. Again, so prior to these dates, you were considered a servant, all right, in law. All right, so after they passed certain laws in these colonies or states, you became legally chattel, like property, like you were taxable. All right, your persons, as they call it, your persons, not just your services. And that applied to white servants you were working along with as servants. This was true also of the subject Indian. All right, we're just talking about you this whole time, Negroes and Indians, up to the 1670 in Virginia, when an act reduced the few Indians that might be imported by sea. By sea, Indians imported by sea, Indians, not Africans. Now, they're not just calling you Negroes. So Indians imported by sea in ships, presumably from the West Indies or the Spanish Main, to a state of slavery. The great body of Indian subjects, being native, however, remained servants up to 1676, when in the exigencies of the Indian War, captives were made slaves by one of Bacon's laws. Before this time, no native Indian, whether a child sold by its parent or a captive of warring tribes, could be legally held as a slave. Acts were passed in 1655 and in 1661 specifically prohibiting Indian slavery and guaranteeing to such Indians all the rights of English servants. So Indians got rights just like the English servants. So what rights did the English servants have? All right, you're still a servant. When the attempt was made to reduce them to slavery, freedom might readily be obtained by appeal to the courts. And that's where we get a lot of these cases and court cases of Indians trying to prove they're Indians so they can get their freedom and so they won't be called Negroes. In 1682, Indian slavery was extended to captives sold by tributary Indians in the hope of mitigating their condition, as it was certain that they would be held in slavery by their captors. In 1691, however, Indian slavery was finally abolished by law.
Now, I wanted, before we get into the details of Mr. Plecker and kind of what happened, because basically your tribe has experienced what's some called documentary genocide. Tell us a little bit about the beginning of the tribe.
Well, as you're aware, in 1912, Dr. Walter Plecker became the first director of the Bureau of Vital Statistics. Prior to that, there were no birth certificates, and he was a director up until the 1940s, 1946, until his death. But he was part of the eugenics movement, which was a movement about creating one race of people, which was white, and everything else was put in a pot, as Tina Marie would say, and stir it up and called colored. But he went beyond board on that, wherein as far as first Americans are concerned, he changed birth certificates and marriage license. He even put out letters to census takers in 1930 that people such as myself that are first Americans and Native Americans, that he considered us as being bastards, that we were just trying to be Indian to marry into the white race.
But basically, when he was the registrar for the Bureau of Vital Records, he changed the names of Indian people in Southampton County, their race, from Indian to Negro or colored.
Well, it was referred to as colored. And basically all the tribes in Virginia in the early 1900s were referred to as colored, okay? Then after the 1924 Racial Integrity Act, everything that was in that colored bowl became negro, okay? And that's one of the reasons why in 1968, the Supreme Court overthrew that Racial Integrity Act and gave Native Americans the right, if they were born before July 1960, to come forward to the Bureau of Indian Affairs and correct those records that had been changed.
All right, we're still in the book by the Johns Hopkins University called A History of Slavery in Virginia. It says here, the recognition of Indian and Negro slavery and customary law came somewhat earlier than that of statute. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, Pequot captives were spared and treated as captives generally were under the sanction of jus gentium as perpetual servants. They were sold to other Indians or to the island and mainland colonies of England as early as 1637, thus marking the first small beginnings of a domestic slave trade. You hear this? First slave trade, the beginnings, with Pequots, with American Indians being sent to American or English colonies that included, England. It actually included, Bermuda, Barbados, Providence Island, and their other colonies, the sugar plantations. Negroes as articles of exchange or purchase were introduced early in 1638, and some of these seem to have been by custom reduced to slavery, as well as to its consequences, slave breeding. So too in Rhode Island, the practice of buying Negroes for service or slaves forever was common in 1652. No legal authority for this status, however, yet existed in positive legislative acts. The earliest sanction in local law was a ruling of the Massachusetts General Court in 1639, confirming a title to slaves specifically. The status servitude, on the contrary, had distinct recognition even in statute law by 1630-36 in Massachusetts, by 1643 in Connecticut, and by 1647 in Rhode Island. This was also the case in Virginia by 1619, in Maryland by 1637, in North Carolina by 1665, in Pennsylvania by 1682, and in Georgia by 1732. So that ample time was allowed in many cases for the local definition of this institution before slavery entered upon either its customary or legal development before slavery developed. In the circumstances surrounding the enactments defining slavery, the natural transition of servitude into slavery is apparent. It is apparent, I guess it's not anymore, right? Particularly in this case with regard to Negroes in Virginia, Maryland, and Massachusetts. Negroes from Virginia, Maryland, and Massachusetts, American Indians. The first essential element in the change of status consisted merely in the modification of an incident, the extension of the term of service from a period of years to that of natural life. All right? This is when you started getting life. Yes, like jail sentences, right? This is when you started getting life. They're trying to say it wasn't just like, oh, all of a sudden they just made you a slave and you all of a sudden in chains and doing Chattel's work and no, it just means they extended your term of service from periods of years to that of natural life to the rest of your life. You gotta serve me for the rest of your life, the same way you've been serving me, same way. What is termed perpetual was substituted for limited service. All right, perpetual servitude, dum diversas, until different. That's what dum diversas mean, until different. You're still on the contract. You're still a perpetual servant. All right. What is termed perpetual? It was substituted for limited service. So what used to be limited service became perpetual, while all the predetermined incidents of servitude, except such as referred to ultimate freedom, continued intact. This fact was recognized in the common language of subsequent law, which frequently employed the terms servant for life, perpetual servant, and bond servant. Bound servant interchangeably with slave, and joined the names servant and slave, and their liabilities in the same enactments. All right, so you see how they started combining slowly, how this was developing. I told you earlier how there was like a whole process. It wasn't just like, oh, let's just make them slaves after today. There was a whole process. They was legally doing this, all this legalese, all this stuff. They were doing this paper genocide from early on, right? First they make you be servants, which was, you know, unnatural because you were free, and then they switched you it up to, you know, life terms of service, life for life, basically becoming a slave legally, bond servant, a bound servant, bond servant. All right. Apparently, there was no marked change of condition, either practically or legally, as regarded the individual. Again, there was actually no change to the servant, though, in their condition, practically, like anything they did, or legally. Nothing really changed. Your rights were, you know, you didn't have the same. You were still a servant. It's just your time got extended. You got life. All right, you got life. So now you're a descendant of a slave. You're actually a descendant then of a servant that got life, if you want to be politically correct then. All right. The master acquired an extension of his right to service and a resultant extension of his obligation of protection and maintenance. The slave lost his right to ultimate liberty, but gained the more valuable right of protection for his life and person. So a lot of, you know, the ancestors were like, hey man, this sounds good. I got nowhere to go, nowhere to live. You know, I'll do serving, and I have clothes, food, and the rest of my life, you know. But I guess, you know, they see that as a right. You know, when you had your freedom, you can take care of your own. You don't need people taking care of you. So the slave lost his right to ultimate liberty, but gained more valuable right of protection for his life and person. It was but the realization in the case of a special class of servants of an aim that had included all in the various attempts to lengthen and constantly renew terms of service so as to provide for continuous subjection, which, if successful, would have resulted in practical life servitude and ultimate slavery. So they would do whatever it took to keep extending your term of service. All right, like they keep doing to us today. You know, they always want us see us behind bars, locked up, in trouble, in court, constantly putting us, oh, now he got to do this, now he's got probation for this, now we got to get him on, oh, now you were driving without a license, oh, you know, all these things. So they keep extending your term of servitude, right? And ultimate slavery. The advantages of this from the point of view of the master in the fixity and certainty of a labor supply and extension of the right of control were so apparent as readily to gain the support of public sentiment, when the class of servants affected were generally regarded as a menace to society if free and uncontrolled. Consequently, as this unassimilated and dangerous element was increased by the processes of Indian warfare or of the African trade, the hijack, that demand seemed just and necessary for a legal extension of the master's power to full limit of control claimed by the possessors of the servant's person before their transfer to third parties. But a more important element of the change of status affected by the several enactments was the extended personal application given both to the modified and other incidents of servitude. They were held to attach ipso facto to the issue of perpetual servants, where both parents were of this status. To cover other cases, additional provisions was made at the time or implied by the statute, or was subsequently enacted designating the parent that conferred status upon the offspring. Such a principle of heredity was wholly foreign at the time to the condition of servitude, and broadly differentiated it from the system which resulted. This first doctrine of slavery, as it might be called, was a natural effect of the conditions of perpetual service. Okay? Again, this first doctrine of slavery, as it might be called, was a natural effect of the conditions of perpetual service, rather than an inference from a legal conception of the absolute dominion of the master in his slave and the consequent inability of the slave to hold property separate from his master. Ideas which had not yet developed in colonial law, however, well known they may have been to the Roman lawyers and to the common law which supported English villenage. It was evident that parents under an obligation of life service could make no valid provisions for the support of their offspring, and that a just title to the service of the child might rest on the master's maintenance, a principle which was later commonly applied in cases of bastardy and servitude.
The trade in slaves proved to be so profitable that Carolina's English and Scottish slavers and their Indian allies pushed themselves deep into Spanish and French territories to hunt for captives. The trade in Indian slaves was a vast enterprise that stretched from as far west as Spanish New Mexico to as far north as the Great Lakes. Virtually every tribe living in this large area was involved in this commerce either as a supplier of captives or as middlemen.
The Caddo traded Lepon Apache, but the Caddo don't really seem to keep slaves. They just kind of trade. It's down the line trade, so to speak. After that, where you have the first count of slaves is more people like from lower Louisiana, the Washoe, the Chawashaw, the Chitamacha, people like that that go into Mobile. By the time they're settled up here and the system is well entrenched in the French trading system, the primary source of slaves was coming from the West.
Many indigenous nations suffered due to enslavement. On the Atlantic seaboard, entire tribes were sold into slavery to the Caribbean.
A compelling example of Indians being sold into slavery in Virginia that's often overlooked is what happened to the Nansadeko people in 1704. That's actually the one instance that we have where a tribe was essentially eliminated as a result of a conflict here. And a small party of those Nansadeko Indians committed a killing of one family, the John Rowley family. But what happened as a result, the Nansadeko were impugned to give up the killers, and they did that. And the killers were convicted in English court, and they were hanged. But the General Assembly also decided that the entire nation could be retaliated against because of what these men had done. So they actually passed a ruling that enslaved the entire population of the Nansadeko, with the exception of children that were under 12, and all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua. And all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua. And all of those people were sold into slavery in Antigua, in the West Indies.
Other than being a convenient source of free labor, the enslavement and deportation of Indians to the Caribbean was part of a systematic plan to eliminate the native presence from the emerging colonies.
Because at that time, they did not talk about being Indians because you could be jailed, correct?
Exactly. There was a lot of bad things that could have happened to you if you were native and if you were caught off the reservation. In some cases, you could be shot on sight. Okay, but getting back to William Lamb, who Paramore and Floyd Painter, Paramore wrote the history of Southampton County, said was the last Chernock-Anotaway riding a bicycle in Cortland. Again, we know that was not true because William Lamb Howah, who was my war chief, is his grandson. But that's typical of what happened to first Americans in the Commonwealth. How things were done to actually change, not only to change one's race, but to change one's ethnicity, to take away their traditions, to take away their cultures, etc. And I'd like to go back to the 1808 Chernock-Anotaway Indian census to my fifth foster great-grandmother, who was Queen Edith Turner. Her name was really Wane Runsira, but the whites called her Turner. And the names, the colonial names, were given to us the same basically as the slave mentality.
The slaves were,
If your mother was a slave and living on a reservation, that means your child was a slave and that you took on the name of the master. So what had happened with native people, we didn't have colonial names, we had native names. My fourth great-grandmother's name was Carahoot. That was her native name, but when they did the census, they pinned her as being Mary Polly Whitson, who married Pearson's Turner, and became Mary Turner and went over to Artistown in 1825 along with the Bozeman, the Browns, the Artists, the Boones, and the Whitsons, and just stayed there until the early 1990s.
So this article is called The Illegal Beginning of American Negro Slavery. Again, the illegal beginning of American Negro Slavery. The American Bar Association, this was a journal from that magazine, volume number 56. This was from January 1970, pages 45 to 49. Now, a more than casual interest in stolen Negroes, it says here. However, to the group of English traders who owned the pirate vessel, the arrival of the first Negroes at Jamestown was more than casual significance, for they had already introduced stolen Spanish Negroes to Bermuda and planned to use Jamestown in a similar and larger pirate scheme. This group of ship owners was loosely identified with James the First, King James, right? And was led by Robert Rich, later to be the Earl of Warwick, a prominent investor in the Virginia Company. So again, this group of ship owners was loosely identified with King James. Yes, the one that wrote the Bible. He helped all these people take all these so-called Negroes and enslave them. Yes, he did. So it says, slave pirate and the Puritan hero. Robert Rich, born in 1587, the educated son of a nobleman, displayed a remarkable talent throughout his life for thriving on adversity and an uncanny ability to cast his lot with the winning side in any conflict. History piously remembers him largely as a leader of the Puritan Revolution, but overlooks the fact that he was a pirate and the first English black slaver to put the gruesome traffic on a business-like basis. Alright, so he was a hustler with this kind of thing. He created the game. Not indentured servitude, but what he was, planning to do with these so-called Negro Indians was basically enslave them for life. Alright? Huge profits in that. So it says Warwick, again, he had changed his name to the Earl of Warwick, right? So now they're naming him Warwick. Warwick and his group in 1614 first obtained a charter from James I for a joint stock company known as the Company of the Somers Isles. Again, this Warwick and his group in 1614, they obtained a charter from King James I for a joint stock company known as the Company for the Somers Isles. The ostensible purpose of the company was to colonize and develop trade with Bermuda, then known as the Somers Isles. So that was Bermuda they were talking about, this company. But it was a thinly veiled disguise for pirating Spanish Main. So why would they go through all this trouble, right, of setting up a company, the Company of Somers Isles, just so they can be a pirate port for them to go take so-called Negroes, Native Americans, from Spanish ships? Why would they go through all that trouble? Why wouldn't they just go to Africa? Like, who's watching them? Even if they say it was illegal and that's why they didn't go directly to Africa, that's what they're saying. But we know better now. We know that it was over here that they were grabbing all the so-called Negroes. So that's why they had to set up shop in Bermuda, get a little closer, and start their piracy. Alright? So let's think logically, alright? Let's keep going. But under this charter, Warwick initially outfitted 2 vessels in 1616, dispatching them to the West Indies for sugarcane and Negroes to introduce to Bermudas.
Alright, so remember from part 18, right? Where these so-called Negroes they brought back from the West Indies, who they were really, right? Remember? We talked about this. They went to Venezuela, right? To get Negro pearl divers, remember? Pearl divers in Venezuela. The Spanish already for almost 200 years were taking advantage of the Indians, right? Making them do their servitude and making them dive for pearls, not Africans. And these are the so-called Negroes they were talking about. So these first so-called Negroes supposed to be the first one from Africa enslaved, and brought to any colony, and it was an Indian. Alright, so go back if you haven't seen that.
After promising results of this initial slave adventure, Warwick embarked on a more ambitious one in 1618. His apparent scheme was to use Jamestown and the Bermudas as a rendezvous for raiding the Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. For this, he allied himself with an infamous cutthroat Captain Samuel Argall, the acting governor of Jamestown. Again, from the Caribbean, not from Africa, from the Caribbean. They were taking these so-called Negroes from Spanish ships. And it wasn't just the sugarcane, there was more money in the slaves. Trust me. Argall made trouble in Jamestown. From his arrival in 1609 until he fled in 1619 to escape arrest. It was he who kidnapped Pocahontas and constantly agitated the Indians. So this was a bad mother effer, you know. Later, serving as acting governor of the colony from 1616 to 1619. He sacked the storehouse, employed his office openly for personal enrichment, and almost wrecked the entire Jamestown venture. Finally, the Virginia Company Council in London appointed a new governor, sending him to Jamestown to arrest Argall. But Lord Warwick quickly sent a ship ahead, whereby Argall escaped, returning with his booty to London before the governor arrived. So this Warwick, right, the Earl of Warwick, which was Robert Rich, saved him and actually helped him get back to London with all his money, all the stuff he looted, all the stuff he robbed from the Indians, and profits he made from them. It says Argall finally went to trial in London, but finagled his way out of the charges and was actually knighted by James in 1622. King James knighted him. First they were going to arrest him, then King James knighted him. You see what the role King James is playing in all this. And you see the role he's playing in hijacking the Old Testament, right? Alright, now we know this King James, we see how bad he was. Now before leaving Jamestown, Argall had enabled Warwick to initiate his Jamestown-based venture in piracy and slavery. The details are smothered with conflicting reports, and the whole affair was secret, but the facts appear to be substantially these. To give his venture a semblance of legality and to obscure the true English involvement, Warwick took his two newly outfitted pirate ships and placed one or both under commission of the Duke of Savoy, Charles Emmanuel I, who was at war with Spain. Now you hear that? So he placed those English ships under commission to the Duke of Savoy. These is Dutch people who was at war with Spain. So that was in their interest, allying with the English. In addition, he obtained letters of Marquet from the Dutch Prince of Orange, also at war with Spain, to give his piratical acts a further appearance of legality. So he's saying they took some letters, they even put signs that they were from the Dutch Prince of Orange, and he put it on the ships, that's where the ships were coming from and that's where they were from. Okay, you're hearing this, right? Warwick sent one of the ships, the Treasurer, to Jamestown, where Argall fitted it out and sent it forth for Spanish plunder. The sister ship apparently stopped at Bermuda, then captured 20 Negro slaves from the Spanish that were delivered to Jamestown in 1619. So you see what is going on here. These first so-called African slaves were actually Caribbean people or Indian people, and they basically, these ships from their Bermuda port went to these Spanish ships and took all the Negroes and their sugarcane, I guess. It says the official records show that they were delivered by a Dutch ship, but most authorities agree that the pirate vessel was Dutch, only insofar as it sailed under the Dutch letters of Marquet that Warwick simply had bought as a cover. You see how they played the whole game. They were really, really smart, really slick. Alright, so in history they tell us that it was a Dutch ship that brought these people from West Africa. That's what they teach us in school. Now we know better, okay? We're seeing the truth. We're waking up. It says later in 1619, the treasurer herself arrived with a second load of captured Negroes. But Argall had already fled from arrest, and the Jamestown colonists feared Spanish reprisal, so the treasurer unloaded only one Negro and departed with the rest of his black cargo for Bermuda. Alright, continuing, it says complicity on the part of the king with a question mark. It is impossible to say whether or not King James himself may have had a share in the Warwick-Argall pirate slaving enterprise, but in any case, after Argall was acquitted of all charges in London, pressured by the Crown on the Virginia Company's management increased. From its beginning in 1606, the Virginia Company had been controlled by a relatively altruistic faction known as the Liberal Party. But the Warwick group, allied with James I, King James, had steadily gained power in the company's council in London. Although friction between the Liberals and James I became obvious in the case of Captain Argall, other troubles soon followed. In 1622, Virginia suffered the Great Indian Massacre, during which 347 people out of a total population of 1,240 were slaughtered. Now this is the Indian uprising, and they killed a lot of these settlers, right? 347 it says here. This incident was seized on by the Warwick-Argall group as evidence of mismanagement. So they kind of use it as an excuse of saying, see, this new governor you send over there to replace Argall is not doing a good job. So they're using that as an excuse, right? It says, finally in 1624, the king dissolved the Virginia Company, taking direct control of the colony under royal decree. So look what King James I did. He basically took over the whole company, the Virginia Company. He was slick about it, you see? They probably even set that up, that massacre. Who knows? That's what they do nowadays. Problem, reaction, solution. That's what they do nowadays, right? Now, it says, the fall of Virginia Company initiated a 38-year period of transition during which the status of the Negro steadily deteriorated in the face of the growing profits realized from the slaving by pirates like Warwick. This transition is difficult to trace because of its insidious development under the official pretense that lifetime servitude did not exist in Virginia or the other colonies. But the transition was evident in both the judicial process and the legislative process. Negro slavery evolved simultaneously yet independently in both branches of the colonial government.
Alright, we're still in the book by the Johns Hopkins University called A History of Slavery in Virginia. The order of this important extension of status to further subjects by statute was Virginia, 1662, Maryland, 1663, Massachusetts, 1698, Connecticut and New Jersey in 1704, Pennsylvania and New York in 1706, South Carolina, 1712, Rhode Island, 1728, North Carolina, 1741. The modification and extension, then, of a single incident of servitude produced a condition of persons that involved momentous consequences. It led almost naturally and under subsequent environment necessarily to that great body of legislation which enters into our historic concept of slavery. All right, so these extensions, these single incidents of extensions of the servitude, it led most naturally and under subsequent environment necessarily to that great body of legislation which enters into our historic concept of slavery. This is where we get our concept of slavery. It was just an extension of the terms of service that indentured servants had. It was the point of institutional divergence, if one is to be sought, where slavery began a course of development more or less independent of the system of servitude from which it descended. Slavery descended. We're in the book, A History of Slavery in Virginia from the Johns Hopkins University. These ain't my ideas. Of trolling. The most important legal incidents developed in servitude prior to this time and passed on to slavery were those connected with the growing conception of property in the servant's person. This conception of property right had passed from a basis of pure personality, where it was but a right to service, resting upon expressed or implied contract between legal persons, to one in which the servant was practically regarded as treated as personal estate, as personality that he was, for instance, rated in inventories of estates, was transferable both inter vivos and by will, descended to the executors and administrators, and was taxable for tithes or titles. You see this? And this is what we read in the other book, right? As a contractual person, he was subject to corporal punishment, to damages for breach of contract, and to a poll tax, while his rights included a limited personal freedom, the possession of property, and protection within the terms of his contract. With the loss of the ultimate right to freedom, the contractual element and the incidents essential to it were swept away, and as the idea of personality was obscured, the conception of property gained force, so that it became an easy matter to add incidents more strictly defining the property right and ensuring its protection. Consequently, the early transition of the slave from personal estate to a chattel real estate with accompanying incidents was easy and natural. So from indentured servant to personal estate to chattel real estate or chattel slavery. All right.
The illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. Again, the illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. As in this period, the country courts began to recognize the institution of lifetime servitude, as it was being created in practice by the planters. So the Negro came to be held under a loose approximation of the indenture system, to become free or remain in lifetime servitude at the whim of his master or perhaps some county court. So you see how slavery changed and it started happening. You see how it first was indentured servitude, then if the owner of these servants decided to keep them, or the court would basically allow them to. And that's how the whole slavery thing began. A judicial inventory of descendants' estate in 1643 showed a white boy with 7 years to serve valued at only 700 pounds of tobacco, but an 8-year-old Negro girl was valued at 2,000 pounds and a Negro boy at 3,000 pounds. The difference in value implies that the Negroes were bound for life, because they knew it was more profit in getting these so-called Negroes, because they were going to have them for life. They weren't going to free them after their contract ended. Other court cases reveal a growing difference in the treatment of whites and blacks. In 1649 Maryland case, for example, 3 runaway servants, 2 white and 1 black, from Virginia were apprehended in Maryland. In ordering their return to Virginia, the court decreed that the 2 whites must serve added time for running away, but declared that no added time would be imposed on the Negro since he was already held to lifetime servitude.
In the year 1636, as part of that war with the Pequot tribe, the turning point was when over 300 men, women, and children were burned alive in the fort at Mystic, Connecticut. The native people that had not been slaughtered were put into slavery, and either in the other tribes who assisted the English in that war, or they were enslaved by the English themselves and sold out of the country in fairly large numbers. And they were sent to various places, and one of the favorite destinations was Bermuda.
Indian slaves were shipped from ports such as Mobile and New Orleans. Whilst the English sent them to Barbados, the French sent them to Martinique and Guadeloupe, and the Dutch sent them to their domains in the Antilles.
We understand the Middle Passage in the sense of Africans coming to the Americas, but few of us understand that there was also a Middle Passage from the Americas to the Bahamas, which were the breaking grounds for the slaves, but also to New England, where the markets were. There were some that were sent back to Europe. The very first ones that were sent back to Europe were the property of the king, the queen, and the church. And so, interestingly enough, many of the first Indian slaves were taken back to become, you know, wards of the state and the property of the people there.
Between 1650 and the beginnings of the 18th century, as many as 50,000 Indian slaves had been sold by the English alone to their colonial outposts in the Caribbean. But these numbers are incomplete because many transactions were unrecorded due to the heavy taxation put on slave cargoes.
A history of slavery in Virginia. In 1670, when slaves were for the first time legally designated in Virginia, the benefits of Christianity as to freedom were limited to servants imported from Christian lands. So servants, they didn't say Africans, Indians, they're saying anybody who was considered a servant. From circumstances which arose later, this principle preserved many Negroes and mulattoes from slavery. The act was passed to ascertain who were slaves and for what time Indians might be legally held in servitude. It was designed to protect Indians from enslavement, but practically it reduced nearly all Negroes or anybody with a status of so-called Negro, reclassified, imported by sea to slavery. So American Indians, other American Indians, while probably most Indians, as they generally came by land, remained servants, though for exceptionally long terms. So if you're an Indian that came by land, you were a servant. If you were an American Indian that came by sea, most likely they will give you the status of slave. Negroes who had been Christianized before importation or who were imported from the West Indies or the English colonies, and possibly those who had been reshipped in England, were reshipped in England. Like Indians, by the terms of the act, only servants. So these so-called Africans or Negroes that were bringing up to replenish the American colonies, the plantations, they were supposed to be automatic slaves and chains. No, these were only servants. The religious doctrine of freedom, inherent in Christianity, began to wane as a practical principle and to be supplanted by the more profitable social principle of fundamental racial difference. So by an act of 1682, you hearing all this? The benefits of Christianity as a mode of securing freedom were definitely denied to all Negroes, mulattoes, hostile Moors, and Turks. See how they separate from the Moors and Turks, the Negroes and mulattoes? And to such Indians as were sold by other Indians as slaves for original heathenism could be affirmed. Right? So people kind of getting their freedom using the whole Christianity thing. So they kind of made an act or law to say, hey, no, we got to stop that. All right. So it included all these people who were doing it. Thus, for a second time, Indian slavery, and for the first time, the slave trade by Indians were legalized. For economic and political reasons, enslavement could now be more openly justified. The importation of slaves was beginning to complete with that of servants, and a stricter limitation of the right of freedom, even in the case of servants, showed the growth of this demand. All right, you see that? So they're not talking about Africans anywhere in here when they're talking about the growth of slaves or of servants.
My grandfather had 18 kids, okay? And he always shared with us our Native heritage. His wife was Ophelia Rogers. That was my father's mother. She was the granddaughter of Alex Rogers, that is listed on the 1808 Sharonockanotto Indian census, who was tried for murder in 1820 and found guilty of second-degree murder. Did 12 years of hard labor, got out, and went into Nansemond County, married, and went over to Hertford County. But at that time, Native people could not testify for each other. I have the whole court case. It was really self-defense. Now, Native people, my people, were classified as mulatto. Okay. Now that was a term that not necessarily mean half white, half black, or half Indian, half white, or half Indian, half black. It was a term that the colonials created back in the early 1700s, and in reality, in many cases, it means purebred Native American. And that term mulatto, I mean, the first one was 1824, the first Racial Integrity Act, 1824, and then 1924 was the last one in Virginia that was brought about during the Plequerism. So when you're doing genealogical searches, unless you can talk to your ancestors, your parents, your grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and I tell people when I do presentations, talk to your people and ask from whence came I, so I can know how far I still have to go, okay?
The illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. Again, the illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. And continuing, it says, a Negro plaintiff wins a precedent for slavery. Finally, this period of equivocal judicial recognition was climaxed with the ironic case of Johnson versus Parker in the Northampton County Court in Virginia, 1653. Anthony Johnson was the first free Negro, Dodge the hijack, in North America and the first Negro landowner. Again, Dodge the hijack because the Native Americans owned all the land. That was their land. So what did it mean, the first Negro landowner, you know? Alright. He was also one of the first substantial holders of indentured servants and later of slaves. So he had indentured servants and later slaves. He was one of them. He actually did what the European white people were doing. Alright? And this is a copper-colored person, right? In 1653, one of Johnson's Negro servants, named Kaiser, complained that his 7-year term of indenture had expired, but that Johnson continued to hold him in service illegally. One Robert Parker demanded that Johnson release Kaiser, amid threats that he, Parker, would testify for Kaiser in court that Johnson held him illegally, resulting under local law in a possible forfeiture of lands by Johnson. Under this duress, Johnson freed Kaiser, who promptly bound himself to Parker for 7 years. So this dude Parker helped Kaiser, but then he said, alright, but now you gotta serve me for 7 years. You see how slick they were, right? Realizing that he had been duped, Johnson sued Parker to repossess Kaiser. The court ruled for Johnson, of course, declaring that Parker was illegally detaining Kaiser from his rightful master, who legally held Kaiser for the duration of his life. You hear this? This is the first case on record of a judicial determination of Negro servitude for life, a precedent set by a Negro as plaintiff. So you see what you're hearing. You hear this, people. Basically, this was the first person that was deemed an official slave for life, and it was through the help of another Negro. Okay? The Johnson case was clearly without foundation in the common law on which Virginia was founded. There were, however, two judicial concepts applied by the colonial courts to trap a Negro. First, there was a kind of circular syllogism. Insofar as Negroes were heathens, they could never become Englishmen. Insofar as they were not Englishmen, they could not be entitled to the protections of the common law. You hear this? Second, it seems to have been taken without dispute in the English New World colonies that the common law doctrine against slavery was metropolitan law, not applicable to the colonies. So they're saying that now they're starting to say that that only applied in England. This is different in the colonies. We don't have to follow that. So first, they're heathens, they don't apply. Then also, that only applied in England, as they say. Although neither concept was adequately supported by precedent, both afforded colonial courts a convenient rationalization for the passive judicial acceptance of the growing practice of imposing lifetime servitude on the Negroes brought to the colonies by the English pirates. Moreover, English appellate tribunals largely ignored colonial courts, since the appellate jurisdiction over these courts was obscure. The colonies generally refused to recognize any right in the Privy Council or any other English body to review colonial judgments. During this transition period in the colonial courts, the legislative process likewise saw the insidious deterioration of the Negro in Virginia amid the growing divergence between the white indentured servants and the Negro servants. All Negroes were listed on the rolls of Virginia as servants, not slaves. You heard that? Until at least 1644. They weren't there as slaves until 1644. And no statutory reference to the lifetime servitude appeared in any statute until 1649. Okay? But various statutes repressing Negroes appeared with the advent of the 1640s. For example, a 1639 act forbade Negroes to bear arms. The official equivocation continued in 1644 statute, which, while sanctimoniously declaring that Christian Negroes could be held only for a term, dreadfully implied that heathen Negroes could be held for life. Okay? If you went into Christianity, you might be freed at a certain time. You had to accept Christ. Alright, if not, you were going to be a slave for life. Apparently, most Negroes were unbaptized, or their Spanish baptisms were ignored. Meanwhile, as the Negroes' statutory status deteriorated, the colonial legislative bodies were taking steps to raise the status of indentured servants. In 1637, Maryland became the first colony to protect indentured servants by limiting their maximum terms of service to 14 years. And in 1643, a Virginia Act authorized indentured servants to register complaints against harsh masters.
So it's an amalgamation not only between free people of color and native people, there was an amalgamation also between colonials. I mean, that happened. Matter of fact, that was one of the things that William Byrd, who was involved in the dividing line between Virginia and North Carolina, and Alexander Spotswood, was trying to amalgamate native people with other races to get rid of the Indians.
Yeah.
Now, when you look at the Byrd papers, and you would read his diary on April the 7th, 1728, he actually visited our reservation in Jerusalem, Cortland, Virginia. And what's so interesting about that, he described how our people look. He said the young men came out and their faces were painted and they made all kinds of grotesque figures and they danced for him to the sound of a gore drum stretched tight within an animal skin. Then he said the young women came out and they were tall and shapely and dressed in their finery. Their hair was braided, and they had white and blue conch shells in their hair that hung like locks and around their neck. And then they had wrapped around their body a match coat, which was red and blue, which is a shawl, that fitted loosely about their body, that their mahogany skin shone through. Then he went. Let me get this point. He went on to say that these dark angels would make exceptional wives for the English planters, and their dark skin would bleach out in 2 generations. Unquote. That's a quote that he made.
So that was the whole goal, was to try to bleach out, as they say.
Yeah, but it kind of tells you that first Americans were a rich brown people. They were mahogany in color.
The illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. Again, the illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. So it says a limbo ends in harsh reality. This transitional period in the legislative treatment of Negroes finally ended in Virginia in 1662 with the enactment of the ancient Roman slave doctrine of partus secutor ventrem, whereby the offspring of a slave took the status of the mother. This made final the Negroes' fate in 2 respects. First, it declared that the issue of slaves were not free, but enslaved ad infinitum. Second, it attempted to solve the troublesome mulatto problem by declaring such offsprings to be slaves. Most mulattoes were fathered by white men, it says here. Most, not all of them. As we read earlier, the Indians and colored people and Negroes were called mulattoes too. The enactment of the partus secutor doctrine ended the legislative equivocation and affected the final divergence of the institutions indentured servitude and slavery. It also contradicted common law, which gave a child the status of his father, not of his mother, but there was little recourse to the common law, inasmuch as the Crown as well as Parliament interfered little with colonial legislative bodies. For example, although James I dissolved the Virginia Company in 1624, presumably to rule Virginia thereafter by a royal decree, the Virginia Assembly nevertheless met continually thereafter without legal authority and without royal interference. Virginia was thus allowed to grow in the light of its own immediate needs. It says black becomes a synonym for slave. You hear that? Now finally in 1699 Act, all free Negroes in Virginia were ordered deported. Okay, you hear that? They were ordered deported. From that day, all blacks were presumed slaves, so that to be a Negro was to be a slave forever. So if you were Negro and you didn't leave, you wanted to stay in your ancient land, then you were considered a slave forever. thus ended the successive legislative and judicial steps leading from the Jamestown Dock in 1619 to total chattel slavery of Negroes in Virginia. The story in the other English New World colonies is not much different. These steps could only have been halted in the beginning, perhaps in the courts no later than the Johnson case in 1653, or in the Legislative Assembly no later than the enactment of the Partus Secutor doctrine in 1662. 1662. If only a few settlers in the struggling colony had spoken out against the evil of slavery, the record fails to show one voice in Virginia raised in protest. This indifference in the most striking aspect of the development of slavery in North America, the indifference of English lawyers, judges, public officials, and all others who might have been concerned, but in fairness, it must be conceded that the indifference was no more the result of callousness than of distractions. Throughout the entire period of coalescence of forces producing slavery, England was convulsed with internal strife, climaxed by its great civil war, the Puritan Revolution in 1642, followed by the Commonwealth from 1649 to 1616. That's funny because we heard that Robert Rich, right? He was the first hero of the Puritan Revolution. So you hear what's going on, right? So they probably did the Indian massacre, right? And then they did something in England to create havoc over there, so they wouldn't be paying attention to what was going on in the Americas. All right. So let's continue. It says neither Cromwell nor later the restored king had the inclination of resources to interfere with the profitable trade in black flesh, largely pirated from hated Spanish, largely or mostly or all pirated from hated Spanish, and the tax revenue it engendered. Incidentally, Lord Warwick, the old slaver and pirate, sided with Parliament in the Puritan Revolution, delivering the royal fleet to the Puritan cause. For this he was made Lord High Admiral, attended Cromwell's ordination, and lived to see his grandson marry Cromwell's daughter. He died peacefully at 71, assured a place in history as one of Puritanism's heroes, doubtlessly enjoying his black wealth in the confident hope that history would ignore the primary part he had played in introducing Negro slavery to North America. It must be remembered that these Englishmen were medieval, not modern. It is not so remarkable that these medieval men practiced slavery as it is that in less than 150 years their descendants produced Franklin, a Washington, a Jefferson, a Madison, a Monroe, who founded Liberia in Africa. It was founded by American Negroes, and those other architects of modern concepts of liberty. Architects, they mean masons, grand architects. So you see, these were the descendants of these first pirate slavers. Nevertheless, at least two lessons in jurisprudence are evident from a review of the beginning of Negro slavery in North America. First, American slavery illustrates the danger of one society's borrowing a legal institution from another society out of context, with none of the necessary accompanying safeguards. English slavery was borrowed from Spanish and Portuguese slavery, with none of the legal safeguards that existed in those societies regarding care and treatment, manumission, marriage, familial duties of the master. Second, that slavery became entrenched in America evidences the evil wrought by governmental passivity to the economic depredations of one social group on another. The English crown, as well as the colonial courts and legislatures, remained indifferent to the perniciously declining status of the Negro in the colonies of the crucial time when their intervention could have saved the Negro from eventual chattel slavery. And that is the end of the article. Just want to go ahead and let you know this article again was written by the American Bar Association, journal number 56, on January 1970, pages 45 to 49.